VP blocked all my vendor contracts, then supply chain collapsed and CEO asked, "Where is she?" Emily Carson's desk was tucked in a quiet corner of the third floor at Nexera Systems, a mid-sized tech firm based in Austin, Texas. She didn't mind the lack of foot traffic. If anything, it helped her concentrate. Her role was as unassuming as her demeanor, supply chain analyst. While others chased promotions, meetings, and attention, Emily dealt in spreadsheets, timelines, and contracts. She liked the predictability. She liked that no one asked too many questions as long as things ran smoothly. And they did. For the past 2 years, Nexera's supply chain had been one of its few stable pillars in a volatile market. Emily's quiet genius was in her long-term planning. She negotiated multi-year vendor agreements that balanced cost and reliability. She anticipated market shifts before they hit, sourced alternatives, and managed risks with surgical precision. If a supplier in Taiwan hinted at delays, Emily already had a backup lined up in Mexico. If a component's price surged in Europe, she had it stocked locally months in advance. But no one applauded stability. No bonuses were given for crises that didn't happen. Her manager, Tom Langley, a pleasant but uninvolved figure, often forwarded emails of appreciation from vendors without reading them. "Great job, Emily," he'd say, then pivot to his next Zoom call. Still, Emily felt a quiet pride in her work. She saw herself as a buffer between chaos and continuity. Every smoothly delivered batch of components was a testament to her foresight. Every green cell in her tracking matrix meant someone down the line could meet a deadline, deliver a product, satisfy a customer. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. That illusion of safety cracked the day Dana Whitmore joined the company. Rumors preceded her arrival, that she had streamlined operations at 2 Fortune 500 companies, that she had an MBA from Wharton, that she used phrases like zero tolerance for inefficiency in casual conversation. Dana came with a mission, one she didn't hesitate to declare at her first all-hands meeting: "We're going lean. We're cutting the fat. No sacred cows." Emily watched the live stream from her desk, her fingers pausing mid-keystroke. Dana was poised, confident, sharp-eyed. She spoke of optimizing supplier relationships, restructuring procurement protocols, eliminating redundancies. Words that sounded reasonable, unless you were the so-called redundancy. Over the next few days, Dana requested full access to all existing vendor contracts, procurement schedules, and cost breakdowns. Her office sent out calendar invites to department heads and mid-level managers. Emily's invite came with the subject line, "Initial Review of Supply Chain Framework." No explanation, no context. In the meeting, Dana didn't ask about Emily's strategy. She didn't inquire about forecasts or risk mitigation models. Instead, she flipped through the contracts with an impatient scowl. "Why are we locked into these 3-year agreements?" she asked, tapping the paper. "Vendors' pricing is above current market average. Why weren't we negotiating quarterly?" This. Emily responded carefully. "The longer contracts guarantee availability. Many of these components have volatile lead times. If we renegotiate every quarter, we expose ourselves to..." Dana cut her off. "To what? Flexibility? Market opportunities?" "No," Emily said quietly. "To disruption." The meeting ended with Dana making notes in her tablet. "Contracts by end of day. I want to review them personally. Send me a list of all active vendor." Emily nodded, already sensing what was coming. By the following week, Dana had begun pushing back on renewals. Legal was instructed to hold off on new agreements unless they were personally reviewed by her team. Vendors started calling Emily in confusion, some alarmed by sudden radio silence after years of reliable partnership. She raised concerns to Tom. He mumbled about adjusting to new leadership. When she escalated further, his reply was hesitant, "Just give it some time, Emily. She wants results fast. Maybe we all need to adapt." But adapting, in this case, meant undoing the very structure Emily had spent 2 years building. She watched contracts expire quietly, relationships fray, and systems destabilize, all while she was instructed to stay focused on execution. The irony wasn't lost on her: the better she had done her job, the less visible her value became. And now that new leadership wanted to shake things up, she had no allies, no voice in the room. Still, Emily worked late most nights, updating models, flagging risks, documenting every shift in vendor behavior. She sent detailed memos to procurement, to operations, even to finance, highlighting long-term risks. No one responded. She started saving copies in a private folder, just in case. From her corner of the office, the collapse hadn't yet begun, but she could already see the cracks forming. Dana Whitmore did not walk into Nexera Systems as a stranger. Her reputation had arrived before her. The board had brought her in not to maintain the current path but to reinvent it. And in her view, reinvention began by unearthing inefficiencies buried deep in legacy systems, like long-standing supplier contracts, for instance, which to her were relics of a company afraid to evolve. Dana's first week was a storm cloaked in corporate polish. She demanded performance dashboards from every department within 48 hours. She cancelled 3 vendor review calls already scheduled by the procurement team and replaced them with something she called competitive reset sessions. Her assistant followed her like a shadow, scribbling notes on vendors, cost centers, and departmental leads she wanted to review. When she addressed the supply chain team for the first time, it was less a meeting and more a declaration of war. "We've been coddling inefficiencies for too long," she said, her voice crisp, almost clipped. "No one gets a free pass. I want every contract scrutinized, every clause justified. We're not going to let habit drive our partnerships anymore." Emily sat near the back of the room, trying not to react. She knew that Dana hadn't yet read the projections, hadn't seen the contingency frameworks, hadn't even requested a walkthrough of how components flowed from supplier to warehouse to assembly. To Dana, those weren't starting points. They were obstacles. By Friday, Dana had sent a request for the full ledger of all supplier contracts signed in the past 3 years. The legal team was instructed to redirect all contract renewal requests through her office. Even small, routine orders, like quarterly shipments of specialized solder paste, were placed on hold pending strategic revalidation. Emily, used to handling these with minimal bureaucracy, found herself reduced to spectator status. She tried, cautiously, to assert her role. In an email sent late that Friday, she outlined the cascading delays that could result from even a 2-week gap in certain agreements. Dana replied 6 minutes later. "Appreciate the note. We will prioritize based on ROI. Assume status quo until further instruction." No greeting. No signature. Just 6 clinical lines of text that changed the entire balance of power in Emily's domain. She stared at the screen, pulse heavy in her ears. Status quo, in this context, meant a slow unwinding of a supply chain built for continuity, not improv. The following Monday, she found out that Dana had met directly with 3 procurement leads. and suggested exploring more aggressive vendor rotation. The phrase echoed in whispers among Emily's peers. What did it mean? Monthly renegotiation? Auction-based sourcing? No. One knew for sure, but one thing was evident: the old system, her system, was being dismantled, piece by piece. In the background, Emily kept working. She updated her vendor performance metrics, flagged high-risk contract expiration dates, and mapped potential service disruptions across product lines. But as she circulated these internally, she noticed something alarming. Where her models once prompted replies and alignment, they now met silence. Even Tom, who had once praised her meticulousness, stopped following up. "Dana wants lean," he said, glancing at her screen during one of their brief hallway interactions. "Let's just see where this goes. Don't overextend. Play it safe. Play it safe." That became the mantra whispered across departments. Procurement analysts stopped challenging price cuts, fearing it might put them on Dana's radar. Logistics managers, once vocal about lead time protections, now deferred decisions to Dana's team. The autonomy that once defined each operational segment was being absorbed by a single, top-down directive: efficiency at all costs. And with that came a new kind of silence, not the quiet of harmony, but the hush of suppressed concern. People stopped questioning gaps, stopped offering alternate routes. They waited nervously for someone else to make the first mistake. In one meeting, Dana referenced a vendor Emily had used for high-precision capacitors, dismissing them as cost-heavy and inflexible. Emily offered to explain the rationale behind their selection, citing failure rates among cheaper alternatives. Dana didn't look up. "If they can't match market prices, we move on. End of story." Except it wasn't the end of the story. That supplier had been one of the few that could meet thermal compliance thresholds without requiring costly post-assembly adjustments. Replacing them meant replacing multiple QA protocols downstream. But none of that mattered in Dana's calculus. Days turned into weeks. Contracts expired without renewal. A component shipment from Malaysia was cancelled due to unconfirmed payment terms. Emily tried to intervene but was told the relationship was under strategic review. She documented the failure points and logged them in a risk report titled Unprocessed Renewals, Q3 Criticality Tier. It was forwarded to 4 departments. No one replied. Her daily routine began to fracture. What had once been a controlled pattern of monitoring, adjusting, and reinforcing now became an endless loop of watching things unravel. Legal refused to greenlight extensions. Procurement deferred to Dana. Operations began reporting inconsistencies in part availability. Yet in the executive suite, the narrative was one of progress. Dana had started circulating quarterly cost savings charts. Without contract renewals, certain expenditures appeared to drop. She highlighted them in executive briefings. Early indicators suggest an uptick in margin flexibility, she said during one presentation. No one asked about service levels. No one questioned delivery variance. And in the middle of it all stood Emily, watching the numbers shift in ways only she seemed to understand. Lower spend today, but a looming price tomorrow. A pipeline filling with uncertainty, invisible to those who only saw balance sheets. She started staying later, coming in earlier. Not because anyone asked, but because someone had to keep tracing the lines that were beginning to blur. She wasn't trying to stop Dana anymore. She had already lost that ground. Now, she was trying to leave a trail. A record. Because soon, she suspected, someone would ask what happened. And when they did, they would need more than explanations. They would need proof. Emily began each morning now not with optimism but with a survey of damages. Her inbox was a battlefield, vendor inquiries gone unanswered, internal teams reporting missing components. Shipping delays creeping into fulfillment reports. It was not yet chaos, but it had become an accelerating unraveling, a slow, methodical erosion of a system that once worked without drawing attention. She knew the root of it. Dana had moved quietly, decisively, and above all, without engaging those who understood the underlying mechanics. The process of gutting Emily's influence didn't come with confrontation. There was no debate, no formal demotion. Just a progressive exclusion from every decision that mattered. Legal no longer routed contract drafts through her. Procurement no longer asked for her projections before altering terms. Even the quarterly strategy meetings she had once led had been rebranded as optimization audits. Now overseen by Dana's chosen team of consultants. What made it more insidious was the precision. Dana didn't destroy Emily's structure all at once. She snipped threads. 1 week, it was a freeze on multi-year contract renewals. The next, a sudden halt to automatic order triggers for components with long lead times. Then came the redirection of supplier communication protocols. Calls Emily used to field directly were now funneled through administrative channels that had no technical context and offered no real answers. The vendors noticed first. Companies Nexera had worked with for years, some small, some global, began reaching out with increasing urgency. Our agreement is due for renewal, haven't heard back. We noticed the auto-renewal clause has been disabled. Do we proceed with the next cycle or wait for formal notice? Emily responded as best she could, explaining that reviews were underway, that things had shifted internally, that she was awaiting instruction. But the longer the silence stretched, the clearer it became that she no longer had the authority to act. Internally, colleagues grew quieter around her. Not out of malice, but out of fear. Emily represented an old way of doing things, one tied to caution, foresight, stability. The new regime championed disruption, velocity, immediate wins. And no one wanted to be seen backing a fading standard in a company now obsessed with transformation. Still, she did not stop working. If anything, she doubled down. Each risk she could not mitigate, she documented. Each delay she could not prevent, she logged. She tracked contract expiration dates, inventory buffers, freight schedules, and escalation patterns. Her reports, once used to make strategic decisions, were now relegated to internal folders marked reference only. But she compiled them anyway, detailed and time-stamped. The worst blow came when she discovered that Dana had overridden a renewal Emily had already negotiated with a critical supplier. It was for a line of microcontrollers used in Nexera's flagship automation unit. Emily had secured favorable pricing through a volume guarantee, locking in stable delivery across 18 months. The deal had taken 4 months to build, involving technical validation, cost-sharing on shipment duties, and alignment with R&D timelines. But Dana had flagged the supplier as non-competitive and cancelled the agreement before legal could process it. No explanation was given. Instead, a procurement analyst received a directive to solicit bids from lower-cost providers, none of whom had passed compliance testing. The last time Emily reviewed them, she confronted Tom, quietly but firmly. That cancellation puts the entire automation line at risk. We've had failure rates above 15% with the alternatives. You know this. Tom looked uncomfortable. It's Dana's call now. She's targeting 30% cost reduction in the next 2 quarters. She thinks we can force suppliers to improve under pressure. And what if they don't? Emily asked. What if we ship defective units and lose the client? Tom didn't answer. He glanced at the clock on his laptop and muttered something about a call. He was late for. The conversation ended there. So she stayed. She continued compiling forecasts based on altered delivery schedules. She reran simulations using lower quality vendor data. She even modeled best-case scenarios for Dana's procurement strategy, hoping something might work. But each path she simulated pointed to the same outcome: instability within 6 to 8 weeks, compounded by supplier attrition and unpredictable shipping delays. At one point, she tried reaching out directly to someone on the board, a former logistics executive who had once praised her attention to detail. She crafted a short message, attaching a briefing packet titled Contract Risk Overview, Strategic Implications. The email was returned by a secretary with a polite note: "Your insights are appreciated. Please coordinate with the VP of Operations for further communication." That night, Emily sat alone in her car outside Nexra's office, the engine off, the radio silent. It was after 9. The building lights flickered through the trees, an illusion of life inside an organism already breaking down at the edges. She didn't cry. She wasn't even angry. She just felt hollow. The next morning, a new instruction arrived from Dana's office: all vendor communications were to be filtered through a centralized review board, eliminating direct analyst correspondence unless explicitly authorized. Emily's access to several portals was revoked without warning. In that moment, she understood the full extent of her isolation. She had not been reassigned. She had not been fired. But she had been erased. The first real crack came on a Wednesday morning. Emily was reviewing updated shipping schedules when an urgent message from the assembly division appeared in her inbox. The subject line read: "Urgent, missing CPU shipment, line 3 halted." The body was short and tense. A shipment of high-specification motherboard units, sourced from a Taiwanese partner under a now-expired contract, had not arrived. The production line had been prepped based on a delivery assurance tied to that contract. But no new agreement had been signed. The vendor, citing policy, had withheld the cargo. Emily immediately opened her vendor log. She confirmed what she already suspected. The contract had expired 2 weeks earlier, and legal had not processed the renewal. Not because of oversight, but because Dana had flagged all auto-renewals for manual review and put them on indefinite hold. The legal team, deferring to the new protocol, had shelved the agreement. And no one had informed the vendor to maintain shipment under provisional terms. She called the vendor herself, bypassing the official channels now clogged with procedure. The account manager answered with hesitant politeness. "We were ready to ship," he said. "But with no formal agreement in place, our internal policies prohibit release. We flagged this 2 weeks ago." No one responded. "I saw your message," Emily replied. "But we were rerouted through a new approval structure. I'll escalate. Can you hold the stock for 72 hours? We can, but we'll need at least a letter of intent. Something signed. Otherwise it gets reassigned to other clients." Emily thanked him and hung up. She drafted a letter immediately, forwarded it to legal, copied procurement, flagged it as urgent, and requested temporary release authorization. No one responded for the next 6 hours. By then, the production halt had already triggered cascading effects. Components pre-assembled for line 3 began aging on the floor, exposed beyond optimal time windows. Engineers diverted their shifts to other lines, disrupting the labor schedule. Logistics began pulling from contingency stock for testing purposes, weakening their buffer for future delays. Emily messaged Tom directly. Days. We need Dana's signature or this line will be idle for another 2. He responded an hour later. She's in board prep. We'll circle back. But Dana didn't circle back. The shipment remained grounded. The vendor's 72-hour window expired, and the inventory was diverted. Nexera lost the batch. That evening, Emily updated her forecast model. She color-coded the impact zones, inventory, shrinkage, overtime cost, potential client delivery breach. She added a new category to her ongoing report. Disruption triggered by unprocessed renewals. The motherboard units were just the beginning. At least 3 other suppliers were in similar contractual limbo, waiting for clarity that never came. The following week, another disruption surfaced. A small but essential supplier of thermal interface materials, based in Ohio, notified Nexera that due to policy changes on prepayment terms, they would be halting further shipments. Their clause had been removed in the latest draft reviewed by Dana's consultants, who considered it excessively protective. Emily had fought to keep the clause in. She had noted the supplier's reliance on prepayment for liquidity. Removing it would damage trust. Now, the relationship was effectively dead. Emily documented everything. She added annotations, tracked the original clause versions, cross-referenced Dana's internal memos. Then, she compiled a 23-page packet and submitted it to Dana's office, marked as a supply continuity impact summary. She didn't expect a reply, but she needed the paper trail. That Friday, she received a formal notice from the compliance team. Moving forward, analysts were to route all vendor communications through Dana's designated liaison officer. Direct outreach, even in emergencies, would require prior approval. The notice included a subtle but unmistakable warning: failure to follow the new chain of communication could result in disciplinary review. She sat at her desk for several minutes after reading the memo. Her screen reflected her face, pale under the office's cold lighting. Around her, the floor buzzed with small talk and keyboard taps, unaware, or perhaps willfully unaware, of the system grinding beneath them. Her world had inverted. Action was no longer rewarded. Silence was obedience. Deference. And yet, the cost of that obedience was growing with every delayed shipment, every lost unit, every eroded relationship. Later that afternoon, she tried a different angle. She reached out to a colleague in operations, someone she trusted, to confirm whether delays were becoming routine. His reply was cautious, but telling. We're seeing more substitutions. Parts with lower tolerances. Some from vendors I've never seen on our lists. Assembly teams are raising flags. Emily probed gently. And what's the directive when that happens? He didn't answer for a full minute. Then, we're told to proceed. Unless there's a safety issue. We keep moving. Substitutions. That meant cost-saving replacements without proper vetting. It meant failures in the field, returns, client dissatisfaction. But the numbers hadn't caught up yet. Not visibly. The revenue sheets were still buoyed by pre-transition orders. The dip hadn't landed. But it would. It always did. That night, Emily stayed late again. She recalibrated her models, not for projections, but for documentation. She was no longer preparing for meetings. She was creating records for when the collapse became undeniable. When people began asking questions. Because the fractures were no longer hidden. They were spreading, slow but deep, behind the polished dashboards and the sanitized reports. And while others continued to pretend the foundation was intact, Emily could feel the tremors in every unread memo, every expired contract, every line that halted without warning. Emily no longer waited for permission to act. She had realized that permission had become a mirage, something dangled just far enough out of reach to keep her paralyzed. And while others navigated meetings and metrics with forced optimism, she began constructing a different kind of report. Not the kind her department typically submitted, but something more dangerous. A full forecast of systemic collapse, based on the current pattern of contract interruptions, vendor disengagement, and procurement inconsistency. She didn't just compile statistics. She built narratives inside numbers. Rows and columns. Outline timelines, dependency chains, average lead time deviation, failure rates of substitute components, and projected assembly interruptions. The heart of the report was a spreadsheet titled Compound Risk Analysis, Vendor Disengagement Scenario. In it, she simulated a 2-month window assuming continued refusal to renew or replace contracts under Dana's hold policy. The numbers told a clear story. Up to 40% of supply continuity was at risk if existing supplier relationships continued to lapse. 10% of the component network would face critical shortages within 30 days. The domino effect on downstream units, shipping schedules, and client deliverables painted a bleak, but preventable picture. She tested her assumptions 3 times. Ran sensitivity models. Inserted breakpoints for best-case pivots. But no version of the model held stable unless existing supplier relationships were re-established within the next 3 weeks. Once finished, she crafted a document to accompany it, a brief, clinical, unemotional explanation titled Strategic Disruption Projection. In its introduction, she avoided blaming individuals. She used only passive constructions. Contractual shifts have introduced volatility. Supplier responsiveness has declined due to lack of renewal clarity. Operational fluidity is contingent upon re-engagement within known vendor networks. She submitted it to the board via the shared leadership portal, flagged it for internal visibility, and copied both procurement and operations leads. Then she waited. Days passed. No reply came. Colleagues walked by her desk, oblivious. Her manager, Tom, mentioned something vague about an off-site planning session with Dana's office. When Emily asked whether the projection had been reviewed, he paused. She saw it. He said, avoiding her eyes. Conditions. She said it was over-engineered. Not reflective of real. Which part? Emily asked, keeping her voice level. He hesitated again. Not hypotheticals. She didn't specify. She just said we need to stay focused on execution. That evening, Emily opened her original file and stared at the timestamp. The data was still fresh. The warning was still valid. But she realized no one would act until the damage became undeniable. Until it showed up on dashboards people could no longer ignore. So she printed a hard copy. She locked it in her desk drawer. And she began creating others, parallel reports, some condensed, some visual, some mapped to the language executives preferred. She no longer believed she could stop the collapse. But she could record it. She could prepare for the day someone would ask what had happened. In the meantime, Dana continued pushing her cost savings agenda. She began publicizing short-term metrics in company newsletters. Q2 procurement spend reduced by 12%. Supplier pool diversification increases flexibility. Redundant contracts eliminated. The phrasing was always triumphant, always stripped of context. What those newsletters didn't mention was that redundant contracts included multi-year agreements with high-performance component manufacturers. Or that diversified supplier pool meant untested vendors with unknown failure rates. Or that spend reduction was the result of halted purchases, not negotiated efficiencies. Emily watched the metrics circulate like gospel, printed in full color on glossy corporate bulletins. Meanwhile, her internal logs recorded increased defect reports, rising downtime in production lines, and growing frequency of emergency procurement requests. She began keeping a second set of logs, personal, encrypted, stored off-network. Not because she feared retaliation, but because she feared deletion. If things spiraled further, official channels might be scrubbed, reformatted, reframed. But numbers didn't lie. Time-stamped data would speak, eventually. If not for correction, then for reckoning. One afternoon, she overheard a procurement manager in the break room joking about a vendor who wouldn't play ball and was now on the list. The remark was made lightly, with the casual arrogance of someone now protected by higher authority. Emily didn't confront him. She simply recorded the name of the vendor, cross-referenced the contract details, and added a note to her ongoing dossier. Elsewhere in the company, morale began to shift. Assembly teams were quieter. Engineering leads started asking more questions. A client had returned a shipment citing performance issues, prompting an internal audit. Dana responded with a memo urging focus and alignment during this optimization phase, reminding staff that resistance to change often stems from attachment to outdated methods. Emily read that line twice. She knew it was directed at people like her. But she also knew something else. The more Dana tightened control, the more cracks appeared in the structure. Not because of sabotage or resistance, but because the foundation had been destabilized. And no amount of corporate rhetoric could stop the physics of collapse once momentum took hold. So Emily kept writing. Kept building models. Each time a shipment failed, she logged the delay, duration and its impact. Each time a vendor withdrew, she documented the date of last contact. The reason given, the previous delivery history. Her spreadsheet grew past 100 tabs, then 200. It became an organism, dense, complex, and unflinching. Late one evening, as she reviewed the latest defect report from the firmware assembly unit, she felt the weight of it all settle in her chest. Not fear. Not even anger. Just certainty. The kind of certainty that comes when the noise of opinion falls away and only the facts remain. She looked at her screen, then at the quiet office around her. She was invisible now. But soon, the silence would break. And when it did, the truth wouldn't come from a confrontation or a memo or a meeting. It would come from a spreadsheet no one had seen. In the weeks that followed, the distance between leadership's optimism and operational reality became not just visible, but jarring. Dana's team continued to publish polished dashboards, refined quarterly reports, and tightly curated talking points that framed every disruption as a transition challenge. Her presence at the executive table became more frequent. She brought with her a vocabulary of performance metrics that seemed unshakable. Procurement agility, adaptive cost leverage, post-renewal vendor fluidity. Each phrase sounded impressive, and None addressed the fires burning on the floor below. From Emily's desk, the illusion was wearing thin. Manufacturing plants were requesting part substitutions at an accelerating pace. In one case, an entire line of circuit boards was assembled using alternative components that lacked full heat dissipation certification. The result was a shipment with 32% failure in field testing. The client flagged it immediately, and Nexera's support team scrambled to issue replacements, absorbing the cost internally to avoid triggering penalty clauses. Yet the issue never made it to Dana's internal review summary. Instead, she celebrated the month's unit cost reduction as a procurement victory. Emily, who had tracked the substitution path in detail, included the incident in her ongoing failure log, noting the absence of a vendor quality reassessment framework under the new procurement system. But she had stopped submitting her findings to management. There was no one left to read them. One morning, she opened her inbox to find a message from a former supplier. The subject line read: "Final notice, account closure." The message was brief, due to prolonged silence and unaddressed account reconciliation. Their company had decided to end all active relations with Nexera. They had been a partner for 5 years. Emily had visited their facilities once during a quality audit. She remembered their lead technician proudly walking her through their testing process. She archived the message, then checked the current sourcing status of their component. It had been replaced by a lower-cost alternative with a 12-week lead time and a 4% higher defect rate in past testing cycles. She added the closure to her spreadsheet, tracking cumulative attrition. Around her, the energy on the floor began to change. Conversations grew shorter. Teams communicated in fragments, not discussions. There was an air of restraint, as if everyone was waiting for something to give. No one wanted to speak up, but no one believed things were fine anymore. In one staff meeting, a warehouse supervisor mentioned they were receiving partial shipments without corresponding invoices or packing confirmation. "We don't know what half of this stuff is until we unbox it," he said. "Sometimes it's not even the right part family." A junior manager laughed nervously. "We're in discovery mode now, huh?" The joke didn't land. Emily looked around. No one found it funny. Production forecasting became guesswork. Assembly teams began preemptively requesting alternative builds based on what they thought they might receive. Errors compounded. 1. Particularly expensive mistake involved a shipment of memory modules meant for a military-grade customer, assembled using civilian-class components due to mislabeling from an unfamiliar vendor. That shipment was never delivered. It was pulled just hours before it left the warehouse, thanks only to a sharp-eyed technician who spotted a serial number mismatch. Dana, when briefed, reportedly responded with a short statement: "If our teams were properly trained, these incidents wouldn't happen." The comment rippled across departments. Emily heard it repeated in hushed voices, quoted in internal chats. For many, it was a turning point. The message was clear: the burden of failure would fall on execution, not strategy. Yet despite all of this, the executive tone remained unchanged. Dana continued to present confidently in board meetings. She referenced procurement victories in clean slides. Line items showed decreased spend. The charts showed upticks in cost efficiency. They didn't show the factory slowdown in Region 3, or the overnight pullback of an aerospace client, or the growing pile of unusable components waiting for disposal. Emily documented it all. She wasn't compiling forecasts anymore. She was chronicling deterioration. The company's communication style shifted, too. Emails from Dana's office became more controlled. Responses were standardized. Questions were deflected with boilerplate phrases like "under review," "decision pending," or "refer to operational directive." Internal documents were increasingly labeled confidential, shared through restricted portals. The tone throughout the organization had become one of surface calm, maintained through suppression. Then came the message from one of Nexera's oldest enterprise clients. It was direct, and signed by name but heavy in tone. Recent product performance has failed to meet baseline thresholds. If this trajectory continues, we will be forced to reevaluate contractual engagement. It wasn't a threat. It was a forecast. Emily knew this client's account. She had worked on the initial contract, built part of the delivery map herself. Their expectations were strict, their tolerances narrow. If they walked, others would follow. She read the message twice, then stood and walked down to the operations floor. She hadn't done that in weeks. The warehouse felt heavier than before. Pallets were misaligned. Some racks carried mismatched inventory. Others stood half-empty. A few employees noticed her and gave polite nods, but no one stopped to talk. She visited the inventory control desk and reviewed recent entries. The data aligned with what she had seen in her own logs. Substitutions were increasing. Error rates were climbing. Some labels now included handwritten notes, corrections made in real time because no one trusted the new vendor's documentation. She returned to her desk that afternoon and added a new sheet to her file. Client deviation. Risks. She mapped the probability of breach by client tier, assigning risk weights based on component criticality and historical defect tolerance. She didn't need to guess anymore. The numbers were making themselves known. That evening, she stayed behind again. Her lights were the last on the third floor. She no longer needed to track potential failures. They were happening. What she tracked now was velocity, the speed at which the system decayed, the places where it resisted collapse, the thresholds it had yet to cross. Above her, in executive offices, confidence remained scripted. But below, in the warehouses and factories, in the procurement inboxes and vendor chat logs, in the unsent invoices and quiet resignations, the chaos had already begun. Emily no longer expected help. The slow collapse had become normalized in the corridors of Nexera, filtered through layers of language designed to obscure responsibility. Terms like supplier adaptation phase and inventory recalibration period appeared in internal communications. Nowhere did anyone admit that the organization had lost control of its supply structure. So she worked in silence, and beneath that silence brewed something closer to desperation. Her models were now being ignored entirely. Procurement had stopped acknowledging her risk assessments. The dashboard summaries provided by Dana's team contradicted her forecasts so sharply that Emily knew someone was intentionally curating a parallel reality. But while the dashboards measured costs, Emily's files measured consequences. In her private projection, operational continuity had less than 3 weeks of runway left before full-on stoppages would begin. It started small, like it always did. A delay here. A mismatch there. Then one of the factory managers sent a direct message late one evening. The message was short, almost apologetic. "We're shutting line 2 tomorrow. Can't risk proceeding with what we received. Too many unknowns." Emily didn't respond immediately. She stared at the words, feeling the weight of them settle into Her chest like concrete. She didn't ask what unknowns meant. She already knew. The last batch from a newly on-board supplier had arrived without documentation. No test certifications. No confirmed compliance. No technical specs. Nothing. She looked up the incident code, added it to her breakdown sheet, and adjusted the failure timeline. Then she did something she hadn't done in months. She reached out to a former vendor directly. One who had been a key partner before Dana froze renewals. Emily knew this would violate the new communication protocols. She no longer cared. The vendor answered quickly. He still remembered her. She explained the situation, only the essentials. If I can get you provisional payment approval, can you still supply the last terms we had in place? He didn't hesitate. We can. But we'll need written assurance. Something with commitment. I can't offer a contract. But I can get a letter of intent. That won't cover our risk. Emily understood. Trust had an expiration date, and Nexera had burned most of it. She reached out to 2 other vendors. Same response. They wanted guarantees. Legal signatures. Advance deposits. None of which she had the authority to provide. She tried escalating through procurement, but her messages were bounced back. She contacted Tom once more, sending a simple note: factory closures have started. I have a way to reverse some of it if we move now. I need someone from executive to authorize a letter. He never replied. She watched the internal chat channels that day, looking for any mention of Line 2's closure. Nothing appeared. The dashboards showed stable performance. No mention of halted units. No note about defective shipments. Just polished bar graphs and generic phrases about efficiency. Transitions. Her silent scream intensified. She stayed late again that night, compiling a document she titled Pre-Failure Logistics Recovery Plan. It included a pathway to reverse engineer the lost vendor relationships, cost projections for emergency reinstatement, and contingency buffer mapping. She knew no one would ask for it. But someone would need it soon. When she arrived the next morning, the floor was different. There was a tension in the air, a kind of wordless acknowledgement passing between employees in glances and unfinished sentences. Someone from fulfillment whispered that 3 major shipments had been flagged by QA for critical faults. Another technician from hardware intake walked straight to the break room without speaking, shoulders slumped. By noon, she received a message from a logistics supervisor. Factory 7's out of thermal sealant. The batch from last week failed bonding tests. We tried to reach procurement, no reply. What do we do? Emily responded automatically. Do not use it. Stop the line if you have to. We already did. Customers are calling. She copied the message into her file. Then she opened a new sheet, active line halts. Unverified components. Within 2 hours, she had logged 3 more. By the end of the day, 5 total production lines across 3 regions had either paused or rerouted activity due to unreliable parts. None of it appeared in the performance reports. Her scream grew quieter, sharper. It wasn't rage anymore. It was resolve. That evening, she accessed her encrypted folder and began curating the full archive. Emails, model snapshots, correspondence logs, decision timelines, alternate proposals, flagged risks. Vendor decline notices, all cross-referenced, sorted, and backed up. She included every document she had submitted and every reply she never received. She didn't do it out of revenge. She did it for clarity. Because when the collapse came, and it would, someone would look for answers. Someone would want to know when the failure began, why no one acted, and who had tried to stop it. In the middle of the night, she received a text from a supplier she had contacted earlier. "We heard from another company today. They're in the same situation. Looks like this is bigger than just your line." Emily read the message twice. Bigger than her line. Bigger than her models. The entire chain was buckling. She typed a short response, "Understood. Stay available if possible." Then she powered down her screen, leaned back, and listened to the silence in the building. A silence that echoed her own, a silence that had never been passive, but full of warning, full of data, full of everything they refused to hear. Her scream hadn't been loud. But it had never stopped. And now it was moving through every halted assembly line, every return shipment, every unanswered call. It had become the language of failure. The collapse didn't announce itself. It arrived quietly, in a chain of halted alerts and unanswered tickets, in the silence of unshipped orders and disconnected supplier lines. It began on a Monday morning when 3 facilities logged 0 inbound confirmations before 8 o'clock. Emily was already at her desk when the first notification came through: Factory 4 had failed to initiate its production schedule. No components had arrived. No explanation followed. Within 30 minutes, 2 other factories reported similar issues. The shared vendor interface showed pending delivery verification across all critical categories. It wasn't just a delay. It was a freeze. The system had stalled entirely. Emily ran a manual override on her access panel and pulled the procurement ledger. What she found was devastating in its clarity. Of the top 20 suppliers, 14 had pending renewal actions marked "no response." 4 others had active disputes over payment terms. 2 had already disengaged. That left 0 coverage on over 60% of component volume. She messaged operations. "Do we have anything in reserve?" The reply was bleak. All buffer stock was drawn last week to cover Region 2. No surplus left. The customer service lines lit up by 9. Complaints about missed deliveries poured in. Clients demanded updates. One high-tier account flagged a service-level breach. Another hinted at invoking financial penalties if delays exceeded 72 hours. At 10 o'clock, an emergency meeting was called. Executives, directors, department heads, everyone logged into the same video conference. Dana appeared on screen with her usual composure, flanked by 2 members of her strategic operations team. She spoke first. "We're experiencing temporary system irregularities due to recent supply transitions. Teams are advised to follow protocol and avoid unilateral vendor engagement. All external communication must be cleared through corporate channels." No one interrupted. The silence was palpable. But faces on screen were tense. Some managers looked down. Others typed furiously, probably dealing with live fallout while pretending to listen. Dana continued. "Alignment. This is a critical phase. Our lean restructuring is working, but external volatility has introduced variables. We anticipated this. Focus on your core tasks and maintain." Emily watched her screen in disbelief. She had seen every model. This wasn't a variable. It was a collapse. Dana had not anticipated it. She had engineered it. Halfway through the meeting, a plant supervisor tried to speak up. "Line 7 is down due to 0 inbound components. We're looking at full-day idle time." Should we pause labor scheduling? Dana didn't answer directly. One of her aides replied instead. All temporary disruptions should be logged and escalated to the transition team. Do not make reactive decisions. It was a script. A firewall. A way to acknowledge nothing while appearing to say everything. Emily opened the vendor portal again and refreshed the page. The outages were now system-wide. She sent a message to the IT desk asking whether the interface was experiencing a data sync issue. The reply was instant: no technical fault. No data to sync. At 11 o'clock, customer escalation reports began arriving. A major medical tech firm reported receiving units with incompatible firmware. Their statement was blunt: we will be ceasing all future orders pending review. Emily opened her spreadsheet archive. She located the vendor whose contract had been allowed to expire in favor of a lower-cost alternative. The new vendor's components had required a firmware patch not included in the current build process. She had flagged it 3 months ago. At noon, the CEO himself, Alan Morse, summoned a meeting. It wasn't scheduled. The call notification came across all department heads as a top priority alert. Emily wasn't invited, but she knew who would be in that room. In the executive boardroom, Dana presented her summary. She outlined the transitional strain, noted ongoing efforts to re-engage supplier networks, and cited external market shifts as the source of procurement delays. She described the halt as a supply-side flux event. She did not mention the blocked contracts. She did not mention the expiring renewals. She did not mention Emily. But someone did. Alan interrupted her presentation, his voice sharp. This isn't flux. This is operational failure. We've lost 3 major clients in 24 hours. That's not external volatility. That's internal mismanagement. Dana shifted in her chair. We're adapting to new realities. Our former processes were bloated and opaque. What we're seeing is short-term disruption during restructuring. And who approved that restructuring? Alan asked. The board approved efficiency mandates. I was given discretion to execute. And did you consult the original architecture before tearing it apart? Dana hesitated. We reviewed all historical contracts and found multiple inefficiencies. Long-term dependencies with vendors that no longer provided competitive pricing. And who flagged the risk of destabilizing those relationships? Dana didn't respond. Alan turned to the legal officer. Was any internal opposition formally recorded? The answer came quietly. Through standard channels. There were objections. Analyst-level reports. Warning submitted. By whom? A brief silence followed. Then, Emily Carson. Alan frowned. Where is she? No one had an answer. Someone from HR mentioned that Emily had filed a medical leave request over the weekend. No further details were available. She hadn't been seen since Friday evening. A few people exchanged looks. Her desk had been quiet for days. Then one of Alan's aides spoke. She left behind a file. It's been sitting in the executive queue since early this morning. Titled Vendor Structure Risk Archive. Alan requested it immediately. Within minutes, the room went quiet as he read through the opening summary. He said nothing, but page after page revealed a timeline that mirrored the collapse they were now witnessing. It was not a sudden failure. It was a scheduled one. Every broken contract. Every expired renewal. Every flagged substitution. Each item had been mapped, predicted, warned against, and ignored. By 2 o'clock, the collapse was no longer a future risk. It was a present crisis. And Emily was no longer in the building. The boardroom had emptied, but the questions left behind filled every corner of Nexarus. Leadership floor. Alan Morse remained at the head of the long glass table, holding the printed report in his hands, flipping through its pages slowly, methodically. Around him, silence lingered. Like a fog. No one dared speak. The timeline was clear. The collapse had been predicted, itemized, and delivered for review. The fact that it was now unfolding precisely as described only magnified the weight of every unheeded alert. He finally broke the silence with a single question: where is Emily Carson? No one responded immediately. Dana looked away. Others exchanged nervous glances. The assistant to the VP of HR pulled up her laptop and began typing furiously, searching internal logs. Moments later, she found it. Emily filed a medical leave request late Friday evening. It was submitted through the employee portal with physician verification. Leave duration listed as indefinite pending evaluation. She hasn't logged into the system since. Alan raised an eyebrow. She left before this hit? Yes. The assistant confirmed. But she uploaded this report at 7 o'clock in the morning. Today. Timestamped, fully indexed. It includes email chains, delivery failures, vendor replies. Even internal memos. She wasn't gone when the collapse started, she saw it forming. Alan turned to Dana. You had access to this? Dana's face was tight. Her documents were not part of the formal review process. They were categorized under analyst projections. I didn't see this version. He didn't reply. Instead, he pointed to the open screen in front of the room. Disengagement log she included. Show it. Pull up the vendor. A staffer complied. The screen displayed a grid, hundreds of cells in deep reds and amber yellows. Vendor names, dates of final contact, flagged warnings, projected impacts. Alan studied it silently. Each entry bore Emily's initials, and next to several, notes that read: escalation requested, no response. Some rows had red highlights with footnotes explaining exactly when and how each supplier's trust had been eroded. One of the supply directors leaned forward and whispered. She mapped it all. Every fault point. Another spoke up, voice low but clear. She even included fallback options. Contacts. Bridge. Pricing. Emergency clauses that could have been triggered. She wasn't just sounding alarms, she was offering exits. Alan closed the binder. And no one listened. Silence answered him again. In another part of the building, chaos continued. Customers were demanding refunds. Manufacturing floors sat idle. Assembly lines buzzed only with the noise of incomplete orders. Managers fielded angry calls. The service team had stopped answering half their tickets, they no longer had answers to give. But at the top, the tone shifted. Alan stood and walked out of the boardroom, calling his executive assistant as he moved. Get me a private line to Emily Carson. Whatever number she listed. Cell, home, emergency. Contact, I don't care. Yes, sir. The assistant said, already dialing. They reached voicemail twice. The third number connected to a clinical office, confirming she had checked in under stress-related symptoms and had been advised full digital disconnection. For at least a week. Alan listened, then nodded grimly. Understood. Leave a message that she's needed. That she's the only one who understood what was happening. And that will wait. He turned to Dana one last time. Prudence. You had every tool to avoid this. You chose politics over. Dana didn't reply. Later that day, a small group gathered in a private meeting room. Alan instructed them to review every document Emily had submitted. Her reports, memos, projections, vendor communication, logs. He wanted it all unpacked. Not to assign blame. Not yet. But to understand. To see the full picture through the eyes of the one person who had seen it clearly. The group worked late into the night, reading through the archives. They found warnings dating back 5 months. Patterns of vendor fatigue. Missed response deadlines. Gradual erosion of shipment integrity. Each stage had been flagged. Each path forecasted. And each had been ignored or deprioritized. One section of the file stood out. A folder labeled Projected Recovery Windows, Conditional. It outlined theoretical re-entry paths if vendor relationships could be mended. It detailed trust, rebuild metrics, re-onboarding incentives, escalation sequences. Even scripts for re-engagement. It wasn't hopeful, but it was possible. And at the center of all of it was a name they had sidelined, buried under chain of command. Protocols, Emily Carson. The next morning, Alan called another executive meeting. It was smaller this time, no more theatrics, no more performance. He spoke directly, without slides. We're not asking who's at fault anymore. We're asking what can still be saved. And the only person who charted that path is not in this building right now. He turned toward the window, watching as the city began to wake outside. Until she returns, we hold. No new supplier changes. No substitutions. No restructuring. We stop. Someone raised a concern. That might mean a full operational freeze. Alan didn't blink. Then let it freeze. He wasn't reacting out of panic. He was acting with the clarity of someone who had seen too much noise, too many rushed decisions, too many egos pretending to be vision. Emily's name was no longer an afterthought. It was now the only name that mattered. Downstairs, word began to spread. Factory managers heard whispers. Analysts began reading the recovered reports. Emily's old forecasts circulated in quiet threads. What once had been dismissed as overcautious suddenly read like prophecy. And still, she remained absent. Her desk untouched. Her login dormant. But the question now was no longer what happened. The question was, again and again, from top floor to loading bay. Where is Emily? The digital file sat at the center of the conference table like a quiet indictment. Alan had it. Mirrored on the screen behind him, every section methodically labeled. Inside the folder were subdirectories that mirrored the full arc of the company's descent. Vendor transitions, contract lapses, escalation patterns, mitigation proposals. Each document was a record of foresight, unheeded, unacknowledged, and now undeniably correct. Alan scrolled slowly through the files as department leads sat in tense silence. For the past 6 hours, his team had combed through the entirety of what was now referred to as the Carson file. It was more than documentation. It was a blueprint, one that could have saved the company months earlier if anyone had bothered to read it. He clicked open a spreadsheet titled Loss Projection Model, Phase 3. A heat map unfurled. Across the screen, each cell representing a vendor segment or component type. Red indicated active failure. Yellow showed near-term risk. Green, ironically, had all but vanished. He paused. On a cell marked with a note, critical dependency flagged, no alternate approved. The Timestamp showed it had been submitted 71 days earlier. Alan turned toward procurement. Was this flagged in any of your weekly reports? The head of procurement shifted uncomfortably. We reported metrics aligned with the KPIs set by the restructuring initiative. That data didn't match the reporting thresholds at the time. Alan closed the file. And now it matches collapse. No one argued. He clicked into another folder labeled Unaddressed Escalations. Inside were dozens of email threads. Some showed Emily alerting operations about component mismatches. Others showed correspondence with legal, asking for contract processing confirmations. Most ended without replies. The names on the CC lines belonged to people now sitting in that room. The legal director cleared his throat. She copied me on several of those, yes. I passed them along to Dana's team when the new approval protocols took effect. Alan didn't reply. He moved to the next file. A document titled Alternative Vendor Recovery Paths outlined a phased strategy to restore former supplier relationships. It listed contact names, summarized contract terms, and even included predicted negotiation points. Emily had written it in neutral language, removing emotion entirely. She had not begged for attention. She had designed an escape route no one asked for. Why didn't we action this? Alan asked. The operations manager spoke quietly. It was sent during the audit freeze. Dana had paused all alternative reviews pending centralized assessment. We weren't allowed to initiate contact without clearance. And she didn't give it. No. Alan leaned back. He had spent his career navigating crisis. He had seen downturns, sabotage, market collapses. But nothing matched the cold precision of this failure, so preventable, so clearly mapped, and so casually dismissed. A junior analyst, recently promoted, raised a hand. There's something else. I cross-referenced the vendor timelines with the service failures. The latency in Emily's projections matches the actual sequence of collapse almost exactly. Not just the when, but the how. He tapped his screen. Component shortages led to untested substitutions. Substitutions increased defect rates. Defects triggered customer returns. Returns reduced client confidence. Confidence loss led to contract exits. It's not just causality. It's choreography. Alan nodded slowly. And she conducted it alone. He stood and turned off the screen. We will not revise these documents. We will not reinterpret them to fit a narrative. This is what happened. And we are going to treat it as the foundation of our recovery, not our alibi. He addressed the room. I want a full operational pause where critical failures have occurred. I want vendor recontact initiated using Emily's templates. I want every employee involved in service recovery to have access to these files. No spin. No rephrasing. The truth only. He paused. And I want a formal communication sent to Emily Carson, requesting her return. The HR lead raised an eyebrow. You want her reinstated immediately? No. I want her respected first. A silence followed. Not out of defiance, but because no one had anything left to object with. The data had spoken. The disaster was not the fault of fate or economy. It was authored by deliberate ignorance. That afternoon, internal systems were updated. A new tag appeared across project dashboards. Refer to Carson file. Operations staff began using the term without irony. Emily's reports became mandatory reading. Department leads marked sections for review. In group chats and Department threads, links to her models were passed around like lifelines. At the same time, Alan composed the message himself. It was not delegated. Not typed by an assistant. He sat at his desk, placed his hands on the keys, and wrote. Emily. What you built saved more than anyone understood. What you predicted, we now face. We failed to listen, and that failure cost us dearly. If you're willing, I'd like to speak with you directly. Not to assign responsibility, but to understand the future. We need your mind. And this time, you will not be silenced. Respectfully. Alan Morse. He stared at the message before sending it. He didn't rewrite it. He didn't dilute it with corporate phrasing. He simply hit send. Then he leaned back in his chair and waited. Not for a miracle. Not for absolution. Just for the one voice they had buried to finally return, if she chose to. The email arrived quietly in Emily's inbox, nested between automated alerts and unread newsletters she had long stopped unsubscribing from. Her screen was dimmed, the brightness dialed down as if the light itself might carry tension. She hadn't opened her laptop in 4 days. Her leave had begun as an act of survival, a forced disengagement before the pressure suffocated her entirely. But the subject line pierced the stillness she had fought to preserve. From Alan Morse. Subject, request to speak. She stared at it without touching her keyboard. Her hands rested on the arms of the chair, her fingers curling slightly. The message wasn't long. It didn't beg, didn't flatter, didn't attempt to wrap failure in excuses. It acknowledged what had happened. What she had seen. What they had ignored. And most of all, it asked, not ordered, for her to return. Emily sat with it for an hour before replying. She said yes. The following day, she walked back into Nexra's building just past 8 o'clock. There was no fanfare. No announcement. But the atmosphere shifted the moment she passed the security checkpoint. A silence followed her steps. Not the old invisibility. A different silence. One shaped by recognition. When she reached the executive floor, Alan met her at the door. He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't usher her in with scripted politeness. He simply nodded and gestured to the small conference room beside his office. They sat alone. No aides. No assistants. Alan spoke first. We are broken. But not beyond repair. Emily didn't respond. He continued. What you built, the logic, the structure, the sequence, it's the only thing we can use now to start again. Everything else collapsed. I know. She said. He didn't flinch at her bluntness. He welcomed it. I want you to take control of supply strategy. He said. Formally. No chains. No filters. No approval delays. I want you to report directly to me. Rebuild what matters. Reconnect the vendors. Redesign what failed. She met his gaze for the first time since arriving. And Dana? She is no longer with the company. Emily didn't ask for details. She didn't need to. Instead, she asked for access, full visibility into procurement, legal, operations, client services. She wanted clearance to speak directly with vendors. She wanted veto power on supplier selection. She wanted her models enforced as operational guides, not recommendations. Alan agreed to everything. She returned to her old desk that afternoon. It hadn't been touched. Her chair, her files, even her coffee mug still sat where she left them. But the moment she logged in, everything was different. Her screen welcomed her with restored privileges. A new title blinked in the corner of her profile, Director of Strategic Supply Operations. Messages began arriving almost immediately. Department heads asking for briefings. Engineers wanting clarification on component substitutions. Vendor managers requesting protocol reinstatement. No one tried to control her calendar. No one rerouted her communications. She was no longer a shadow in the system. She was the system. That evening, she held her first meeting with the Recovery Task Force. She didn't bring slides. She didn't speak in metaphors. She opened with data, real numbers, unpolished and uncompromising. She showed the full breakdown: supplier exits, contract voids, component mismatch reports, client attrition rates. And then she showed them what was possible. We can recover, she said. But we don't do it with apologies. We do it with consistency. She outlined the phases: reinstate trust with high-priority vendors, reintroduce verified components, halt all substitutions not cleared through multi-point validation, rebuild multi-year agreements with risk buffers, and overhaul escalation pathways. Someone asked, cautiously. And what if the board pushes back? Emily's voice didn't waver. Then I escalate to Alan. And Alan won't push back. Across the table, heads nodded. They weren't just listening. They were following. Over the next days, she began calling former vendors. Some were wary. Some had already committed to new partners. But when she spoke, she didn't use corporate language. She didn't offer excuses. She offered clarity. We failed you, she said. But I'm not asking you to forget. I'm asking if you're still willing to rebuild on your terms, with transparency. One by one, they responded. We'll talk. Send the new terms. Welcome back, Emily. Every evening, she stayed past the last echo of footsteps. The office emptied around her, but she kept working. Not out of obligation. Not even out of revenge. But because what she had warned of had happened, and now she was the one they trusted to reverse it. Late one night, while updating the new vendor integration matrix, she received a message from Alan. Everything you asked for is in motion. Just let me know if you need more. She replied simply. I need time. And I need everyone to stay out of the way. He wrote back. You have both. By the end of that week, the first green lights returned to the tracking dashboard. Not just on paper. Actual shipments confirmed. Verified quality checks. Vendors sending early notices with confidence. Factories receiving parts they could trust. Nexera hadn't recovered. Not yet. But for the first time in months, it had stopped breaking. And in the center of that fragile rebirth was the one person they had once dismissed, the analyst whose silence had been mistaken for passivity, whose data had been mistaken for pessimism. Now, they didn't ask her for predictions. They asked her what to do next. Rebuilding a broken system is never about returning to what existed before. It is about deciding what must be preserved, what must be discarded, and what must be reinvented entirely. Emily knew this from the moment she took the reins. She didn't seek to restore Nexera's former operations, she sought to rebuild them with new rules, new expectations, and new resilience. Her first directive was absolute: no new contracts signed without a complete vendor capability verification. She reinstated the original multi-criteria assessment model, then expanded it. Cost alone could not define a partnership. She introduced metrics for supply consistency, failure response rate, lead time adherence, and communication transparency. Vendors previously ignored or pushed out were contacted again, not with desperation, but with a clean proposal, built on mutual respect and long-term alignment. The procurement team, once shaped by Dana's top-down pressure, adjusted quickly under Emily's command. She handpicked a new lead to oversee negotiations, someone she trusted to prioritize substance over optics. Together, they dismantled the short-cycle purchasing strategy and replaced it with structured, tiered contracts. Each vendor relationship now included exit clauses that protected both parties, predefined escalation ladders, and review checkpoints. Every quarter, the legal department, too, adapted. Emily instituted pre-approval protocols for contract redlines. No clause could be altered without review from her new strategy desk. Gone were the days of rubber-stamping edits to meet superficial savings. Every legal decision now had to answer a single question: does this support operational stability? But perhaps her most significant change was cultural. Emily refused to lead from behind closed doors. Twice a week, she walked the production floors. She listened, not just to managers, but to technicians, assemblers, even forklift operators. She asked what had gone wrong, how it felt to work through the collapse, what they needed to trust the system again. One technician, adjusting a calibration unit near line 6, summed it up simply: we just want to know the people up top won't trade predictability for profit again. Emily nodded. That's not the kind of leadership we're building anymore. She introduced a new principle: upstream accountability. If a component failed in assembly, the supplier was notified, and the procurement team met with production leads to dissect the root cause. No more siloed blame. No more buried mistakes. The dashboards were rebuilt, too. Not by consultants, but by her own analytics team. Emily removed all euphemistic categories: no more volatility tolerance or agility metrics. In their place, vendor delivery adherence, QA deviation ratio, lead time trendline, and recovery velocity index. Metrics that reflected the real health of operations, not just their financial veneer. Each week, Emily held a transparency meeting with cross-functional leads. She didn't present slides. She displayed raw data and asked, "Where are we weak?" It became a ritual, one that reminded everyone that truth was not something to be feared, but something to be used. As the months unfolded, the transformation became visible. The first client to suspend their partnership returned. They cited immediate and sustained improvements in supply predictability, and praised the new documentation standards. Another client upgraded their contractual tier, pointing to Nexera's new vendor scorecard as evidence of organizational maturity. Internally, defect rates dropped by over 50%. Line stoppages, once weekly occurrences, became rare. But the recovery wasn't perfect. Not every vendor returned. Some had moved on. Others had doubled prices. A few refused to reopen communication. Emily accepted those losses. They were part of the cost of arrogance, one she catalogued alongside every other mistake. She documented each step of the reconstruction. Not to glorify it, but to preserve it. Future teams would need to understand the path they took, and how fragile even the best systems could become when mismanaged. One evening, her team gathered in the restructured strategy room, a space that once hosted Dana's efficiency reviews. The tone was different now. Less scripted. More grounded. A junior analyst presented a new supplier proposal. It showed strong pricing but limited Historical reliability. The room waited for Emily's judgment. She asked. How quickly could they correct a misdelivery based on their track record? The analyst hesitated. It's unclear. They haven't shared incident logs. Then the answer is no. Emily said. We don't onboard what we can't predict. No one challenged her. They didn't need to. Her standards had become the company's standards. Later that night, walking through the quiet corridors, Emily passed the service department. Lights still glowed behind frosted glass. She paused, then entered. The support manager greeted her with tired eyes but a grateful smile. We're almost caught up on all unresolved tickets, he said. That hasn't happened in 8 months. Emily nodded. It's not about perfection. It's about consistency. He gestured to a whiteboard filled with tracked complaints. Timelines again. Clients say they finally trust our. That was all she needed to hear. She returned to her desk and opened her archive. Inside, she created a new folder, Stability Phase. It would log every restoration point, every renewed agreement, every metric that proved systems were holding. The collapse had taught her that systems break silently before they fail publicly. But it also taught her that systems could be rebuilt, not by slogans, not by speed, but by steady, visible choices that refused shortcuts. Nexera wasn't fixed. But it was being rebuilt. And this time, the foundation wasn't ambition or velocity. It was discipline. And at its center was a single principle, what Emily had always understood, and what everyone now followed. Stability is not the absence of crisis. It is the presence of preparation. The glass walls of Nexera's headquarters no longer felt like a facade. For the first time in over a year, the transparency they symbolized matched the culture inside. Departments communicated with directness. Teams operated from shared definitions. Forecasts aligned with reality. Across the company, people had stopped whispering warnings and had started building plans. At the center of that transformation was Emily Carson. It had been 8 months since the collapse. 8 months since the operational freeze, the client losses, the hollow dashboards. 8 months since Emily returned, not as an analyst, but as the steward of a new doctrine, one built on clarity, caution, and the audacity to plan without shortcuts. Now, in the executive decision room, her presence was constant. She no longer waited for invites. Her insights were requested before meetings even began. Her models shaped product timelines. Her approval marked the difference between risk and resilience. On a gray Monday morning, the room gathered again. This time for a different purpose. Alan Morse stood at the head of the table. His posture was steady, his tone calm. There were no screens turned on. No slides to project. Just people listening. We've been in recovery mode for most of this year, he began. And while that process isn't finished, we're no longer in crisis. We're choosing again. Choosing how we lead. Choosing how we decide. He paused, then continued. Today, we formalize something we've lived for months. We institutionalize it, not as a gesture, but as structure. He gestured toward the far wall. There, covered with a temporary curtain, was a plaque. He nodded toward the facility's lead, who stepped forward and pulled the fabric away. Etched in brushed metal were the words, "The Carson Decision Room." A silence settled over the room. Not one of shock, but of recognition. Alan stepped aside. We don't name rooms in this building after concepts anymore. Not strategy. Not transformation. Not velocity. We name them after people. People who make decisions that matter. And who live with the consequences. He looked at Emily. We ignored what she saw. She built the very model that could have prevented collapse. And then, when it did collapse, she didn't seek retribution. She sought structure. This room, and the decisions made in it, now bear her name. Because when the noise cleared, the only voice worth following was hers. Emily said nothing. She hadn't known this would happen. She hadn't asked for it. But as the others turned toward her, some with quiet smiles, others with nods of respect, she understood what it meant. It meant permanence, not of glory, but of accountability. Later that day, she met with her team as usual. They reviewed upcoming supplier evaluations, audited onboarding logs, identified pressure points in 2 overseas shipping routes. Business, as always, was granular and real. No one mentioned the plaque again. That wasn't the point. In the cafeteria, a junior employee whispered to a colleague. She's the one, right? The Carson room. The colleague nodded. Yeah. She's why we're still here. Weeks passed. The rhythm of the company held steady. Procurement stabilized. Assembly lines met deadlines. Vendor relations matured. Clients renewed contracts. New partnerships were approached with care, not charm. Every quarter, Emily published a report, not for celebration, but for transparency. Each began with a simple line, assumptions stated, risks tracked, corrections logged. Her language never changed. It didn't need to. One day, as she was leaving the building late in the evening, she passed a group of interns gathered near the elevators. One of them noticed her and said her name, almost in awe. You're Emily Carson. She turned, surprised by the directness. He continued. They told us about what you did. About how you predicted the collapse. And then rebuilt it. I just wanted to say, thank you. She didn't deflect. She didn't joke. She simply replied. Finally listening. It wasn't just me. It was a lot of people. He nodded, then asked. How did you know it was going to fall apart? Her answer was simple. I didn't know. I just paid attention to what no one else wanted to see. When the elevator arrived, she stepped in alone. The doors closed behind her. At her desk, a new request was waiting. A supplier from Germany was proposing a long-term integration plan. It was detailed, balanced, promising. She opened the file, ready to review. Because even with a name on the wall and a title at the top of the chart, her focus had not changed. She wasn't there to be right. She was there to ensure that what nearly broke them would never happen again. And in every decision that followed, in every policy, every forecast, every signature, her name remained, not as a badge of crisis, but as the emblem of what it means to lead when no one else will. Emily Carson. The name in the room. The voice they finally heard. The decision they chose to remember. As the room named after her remained filled with the sound of reason, reflection, and restraint, Nexera quietly stepped into its future, this time, by design.